On 23rd of December 1947, scientists at Bell Laboratories presented an invention that changed the history of mankind forever: the transistor. Transistors are electronic components capable of controlling and regulating currents of electricity. They are something like switches, but instead of being activated manually, they are activated by electrical signals. This may not seem like a big deal to you, just one invention among thousands. However, the fact that transistors can regulate electrical currents autonomously made them one of the most fundamental pieces of modern technology. Let me explain. As many of you already know, computers, cell phones, and many electronic devices that we use every day work based on binary code, a language that has only two symbols, 1 and 0. Well, a transistor, among other things, allows to communicate signals in these two symbols. If the transistor is off, it will send the 0 signal, but if it is on, it will send the 1 signal. In a manner of speaking, transistors are the neurons that allow electronic devices to communicate in binary code. That is why the more transistors a computer has, the more messages in binary code it can process, and therefore, the more powerful it will be. Hence, the first computers in history, like the ones that you're seeing on the screen, were so large and took up entire rooms. To achieve even a little power with such large transistors, a lot of space had to be used. In any case, as time went by, transistors became progressively smaller. That made it possible to put more and more of them inside our computers, making them more and more powerful. In fact, today's transistors are so tiny that even if we grouped 20,000 of them together, they would still be smaller than the diameter of a human hair. What's more, in your mobile processor alone, there are probably 15 to 20 billion transistors. Yes, I know, it's really unbelievable, but why are we telling you all this? What does this have to do with the economy? Well, you see, the reason we have been able to make enormous progress with our technology to date is because we have been able to reduce the size of transistors more and more. Specifically, the number of transistors per processor has been doubling every 2 years. In other words, the computational capacity of our devices has been increasing exponentially up to the present day. This exponential growth is what is known as Moore's Law, and so far it has been fulfilled to perfection. However, there is one problem in all this. Physics has limits. There will come a point when transistors will be so small that they simply cannot be made any smaller. We will hardly be able to make transistors on a subatomic scale, and therefore Moore's Law will no longer apply. And I'm afraid that, according to some experts, that time may have already come.
Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang justifies price hike by saying Moore's Law is dead.
According to the CEO of Nvidia, the world's leading producer of graphics chips, Moore's Law has come to an end. And if this is true, the enormous computational progress we have experienced so far will come to a screeching halt. It will be much more difficult to continue advancing technology, and basically, we will have reached the limits of digital development. But beyond that, let me throw a question at you. Is it possible that what is happening with the apparent death of Moore's Law is not an issue unique to the world of electronics, but to the economy in general? Is it possible that other aspects such as innovation, industry, or economic advances are slowing down as well? As if science and human productivity is reaching its natural limits? Well, the truth is that there is a lot of data pointing to this. As with Moore's Law, since the Industrial Revolution, productivity in the world's major economies had been growing in an exponential pattern, higher and higher. However, by the 1980s, something had changed. Since then, economic development seemed to slow down suddenly, and it began to grow at much more modest rates than usual, as if it had become disconnected from this exponential growth. It is a simple fact. The world's economies are slowing down, and have been doing so for more than 40 years. So in the face of this, I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves some questions. Is it possible that we are close to the physical limit for economic growth, as is the case with transistors? Are we doomed to stagnate economically? Is there anything we can do to prevent the decline of innovation and productivity in our societies? Well, today on Visualeconomik, we will answer those questions. Let's get started. So the first question we must answer to find out whether or not we are at the limit of economic growth is the following. What happened from the 1980s onwards for productivity to start increasing at much slower rates than usual? Well, there are several possible explanations to this question, but the first of all is that we are simply running out of ideas. It's becoming increasingly difficult to find a place to innovate or simply to develop new inventions. For example, in the 1970s, maintaining Moore's Law, that is, doubling the number of transistors in processors, cost 1/15 of what it costs costs today. Advancing computationally was 15 times easier than it is today, and it makes a lot of sense. In order to keep creating smaller and smaller transistors, more and more advanced technologies are needed. It is more and more difficult to achieve and much more limited. And of course, if we apply the same concept to the economy, we will realize that 200 years ago, the margin for innovation was much wider. Combustion engines, electricity, running water, telecommunications had all not yet been invented. Anyone who took the time to study and innovate could be capable of discovering completely revolutionary inventions. In fact, this is something we can see with the Apple Computer 1, the first personal computer that was designed in a garage by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Now, however, the feeling is that everything has already been invented. It is very difficult for a person at home to invent the new light bulb, the new computer, or the new steam engine. It is as if everything has already been invented, or truer than ever, and hence economic progress has slowed down. Be that as it may, the problem of our economic stagnation is far from over, so beware.
Doomed to stagnation?
Beyond the theory of the end of ideas, there is another theory that suggests that economic stagnation would not be an unusual scenario. This theory says that what we have experienced from the Industrial Revolution until now has simply been an exception. You see, for 97% of history, human beings have lived through stages characterized by stagnation. While it is true that in some specific times and places, such as during the Roman Empire, economies improved, these improvements were later offset by other times of decline, epidemics, and widespread famines. The normal thing from a historical point of view is not to improve economically, but to remain stagnant in time, with better and worse moments. Yes, but in the end, basically stagnant. That is why the enormous economic expansion that we have experienced in the last 200 years has been only a temporary exception. And now, we would only be returning to normality. We would be returning to a stagnation that will last for hundreds of years. And this may make even more sense if we take into account other factors, such as the demographic collapse. Just look. For several decades, the number of births per woman has been plummeting. If this trend is not reversed, sooner or later, the world population will begin to decline without any apparent limit. And what are the implications of that, you may ask? As there are fewer and fewer people, companies will find it more difficult to invest in new innovative projects because they will not be able to count on enough workers. At the same time, there will be less room for the birth of great innovative geniuses or great entrepreneurs capable of revolutionizing the world, like Albert Einstein or Nikola Tesla. On the other hand, fewer people means smaller markets in which to sell. In other words, investments in innovation will have less potential to sell in the market because there are fewer consumers. Therefore, companies will innovate less and less. But do you want to know the worst of it? The worst thing is that a decreasing demographic means an older society. We will have to allocate more and more resources to old age, healthcare, dependency, social assistance, resources that will no longer be available for young people or for investment to promote economic development. And Visualeconomik viewers, all this explains news like the following.
China's falling birth rate threatens economic growth. Europe faces aging population nightmare in absolute collapse.
The future looks bleak. All the theories we've just told you are absolutely hopeless. But at the end of the day, these are just theories. There is nothing that can confirm for certain that stagnation will happen. What's more, there are very good arguments for thinking that everything we have just told you are prophecies of disaster that need not come true. Now, do you want to know what these arguments are? Well, pay attention.
A new hope.
At the start of this video, we said that Moore's law was about to come to an end, saying that our computing power has reached its physical limits, and that soon it will not be possible to make transistors smaller than those that already exist. But do you know what? This is not the first time the death of Moore's law has been announced. 10 to 15 years ago, it was thought that due to the limits of physics, transistors could never be smaller than 7 nanometers. However, this apparent physical limit is already being far exceeded.
3 nanometers is close, but so are 1 nanometer chips. Liu Dian, CEO of TSMC, explained at the International Solid State Circuits Conference how everything seems to be going smoothly in its development of 3 nanometer photolithographic technologies.
Technological progress has made it possible to overcome apparent physical challenges that were once thought to be insurmountable. And how has this been achieved? By designing new processor architectures, inventing new techniques, and developing new ways to pack transistors into smaller spaces. For all these reasons, Intel, the historic leader in the processor market, has communicated on its website that Moore's law is still very much intact, and that as long as there is research, it does not look like this law will die in the near future.
There are numerous options available to continue to double the number of transistors per device at the cadence demanded by our customers. Moore's law only stops when innovation stops, and innovation continues unabated at Intel. Intel's statement.
Just as the death of Moore's law has been predicted on several occasions in the past, so has the death of economic progress. For example, in 1939, after the Great Depression, the economist Alvin Hansen claimed that a new economic order was approaching, that the prosperity of the 19th century could end, and that the world was about to enter a secular stagnation. Well, I don't have to tell you, but Hansen's predictions didn't exactly come true. There was no change in the world economic order, quite the contrary. In any case, maybe this time it will be different. Maybe with the demographic collapse, with the end of ideas, maybe now the prophecies of stagnation will in fact come true. And well, let's see. On Visualeconomik, we don't have a machine to see the future, not yet. But it is true that demographic aging, for example, is going to pose some difficulties. One of them is that there will be fewer and fewer people to work in companies. At the same time, companies will be able to solve these problems by investing in robotization and automation. Did someone say ChatGPT? Without going any further, today an average SP 500 company needs only 2 employees to generate $1 million, while in the 1980s it needed 8. On the other hand, it is also true that having fewer and fewer children will reduce the potential number of geniuses and great innovators like Albert Einstein and Nikola Tesla. But at the same time, families with fewer children will also be able to invest far more resources into educating their children, making them more productive and making them have greater individual potential than traditional families of 3, 4, and 5 children. In the same vein, fewer people also means less pressure on natural resources, cheaper housing, less pollution. And if all that were not enough, the fact is that demographic collapse is not yet a certainty. The population may fall for a few decades, but it is possible that it will increase again in the future. The future is far from bleak, but what about the end of ideas? Is it true that it is becoming increasingly difficult to innovate, that everything important has already been invented? Well, it is true that in some respects it is more difficult to innovate than it was decades ago, but it is also true that we have many more resources available to do so. Without going any further, we have practically all the world's information at our very fingertips on our cell phones. Another thing to keep in mind is that if we were to go back in time and talk to a person from the 20th century, he or she would also think that everything had already been invented. Basically because imagining inventions that do not yet exist is very, very complicated. An example of this are these paintings published by National Geographic, drawn by people from the 19th century, who imagined what life would be like in the year 2000. Notice that they were not at all capable of guessing the great developments that were to take place in the future. They were simply able to imagine slight modifications of the world in which they already live. Their minds were unable to even come close to all that was in store. I'm thinking of those that picture of the people walking on water with balloons. That's a funny picture. Surely something similar is happening with us right now. We think that everything has already been invented, but we think so because what has not yet been invented is simply just too difficult to imagine. What I can tell you, there are many reasons to think that we have a wide range of inventions ahead of us. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, genetic medicine, research in new materials, 3D printing, space exploration, design of brain devices. Anyway, it doesn't look like the apocalypse. In any case, let's not get distracted by more optimistic or more pessimistic theories. One thing is clear. The graph we showed you earlier seems clear. Productivity growth has slowed down. This is an objective fact. Our productivity is no longer growing exponentially as it did until the 1980s. Is this confirmation that the pessimistic theories are right, or is there a catch in the whole thing? Well, let's take a look.
What does the data actually say?
As with Moore's law, the world's economists have always believed that the productivity of our modern societies has been growing exponentially. That exponential growth is the blue line we saw in the graph before. However, in 2022, a new scientific paper that reviewed historical growth data in detail showed that this belief was not true. Productivity in our societies never grew exponentially. Failing that, the paper showed that productivity grew in a linear fashion, that is, following a straight line. A straight line which at certain points in history became more vertical, and that made economies to start growing faster. These moments of change coincide with the great technological revolutions in history. For example, the first and second industrial revolutions, which are represented by the two red lines in the graph. If we accept this analysis and return to the current growth chart, we will see that by applying a straight line growth model, it seems to match the data much better than the exponential growth model. In other words, we have not slowed down our productivity progress. We are still on the straight line trend, corresponding to our times, a line that has been more or less stable since the 1990s. 1930s. The question is, will there be a new growth stage in the future? A new period with an even more vertical line? Well, probably, yes. When there is another large-scale technological change. This is something that has occurred at intervals of between 100 and 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. So yes, possibly, we will again enjoy a new era of great expansion. By the way, one curious fact, the technological breakthroughs that cause the vertical changes in the line are known as general purpose technologies, or by the acronym GPT. Ironically, this coincides with the name of the artificial intelligence ChatGPT chatbot, one of the elements that precisely could lead us to a new great technological revolution. Be that as it may, in all this statistical stuff, there is still more work to be done. Another very important thing that is not often taken into account is that the economic measures we use, measures such as GDP and CPI, were designed decades ago. They were measurement systems designed to study economies based on the production of wheat, steel, or shoes. So what's wrong with this? Well, the problem is that measuring the technological development of today's economies is a real headache. For example, it is very difficult to measure the impact on social welfare of free things like Wikipedia, YouTube, Google Maps, or WhatsApp. How much convenience is generated by being able to be in contact with the whole world at practically no cost and regardless of distance? It's very difficult to take into account with crude measures, such as GDP, that we have more and more variety of products available in stores and supermarkets, that 20 years ago, we could not watch the movie we wanted on Netflix, nor of course imagine content such as that which exists on YouTube. All of that is not included in GDP, and therefore not included in productivity measures. But do you want more? 50, 100, 200 years ago, everything that was produced was done at enormous costs that were not reflected in the GDP. In the past, economies grew a lot, but they did it at the cost of polluting, of dirtying the oceans, of poisoning the atmosphere with lead. Due to leaded fuels, the ozone layer was destroyed, and a lot of resistance to antibiotics was created due to their overuse. In short, previous economic growth was not so fantastic if we include all these costs, but at the same time, we are now able to produce with fewer and fewer pollutants, and to recycle and care for our environment much better. In other words, we are able to better preserve our wealth, undoubtedly. All this also implies the enormous technological progress that we are currently experiencing, but again, it is not included in the GDP or productivity statistics. Having said all this, the main conclusion of this video is that, although the future holds challenges, undoubtedly complex ones, not everything is as dark as it seems. We must take the statistics with a grain of salt and leave some room for some optimism. That is why, now, the questions are all over to you. Do you think there is a clear limit to economic growth? Are you more optimistic or pessimistic about our near future? Are there other important arguments that we have not explained in this video? You can leave your answers in the comments. If you like the video, please like it and subscribe. Hit the little bell icon so you don't miss any of the next ones, and I'll see you next time.